Folks, this is a story about America's first serial killers that ever happened and really documented. And, this was actually right after the birth of our country back in the 1700s, late 1700s. And the name of these people were called the Harpe Brothers. Now, the Harpe Brothers were supposedly from Scotland and immigrated here to North Carolina. And then as the Revolutionary War started, I think their parents were Tories. They were with England and the King, and that didn't go down for them good later because I think either they got hung or they got their land taken away from them. But the Hart brothers, which were actually cousins, they didn't have the same father, but the way they hung around, though, you would never know that because they went everywhere together, did everything together, including marriages and their relationships in that regards. But the reason why I found this story was I was looking at Lord Still's haunted history of Knoxville. And I didn't realize, hey, the first serial killers were around Knoxville, Tennessee. Wow, I didn't know that, but they were, and particularly being in North Knoxville, and supposedly they named it the Powell area on Beaver Creek, which could include Halls and Hardin Valley as well, because it's all on the creek there. But that's where they started. So this is a really harsh story. It's very graphic. So I'd warn anybody that doesn't want to hear a lot about murders, you don't want to hear this story. Now, Micajah Harpe was called Big Harpe because he was big and brawny and strong, and then Wiley was called Little Harpe because he was smaller but kind of more devious on his way he liked to kill people. And that particular trademark that he has was to disembowel somebody and then fill their body up with rocks and then put them in a creek or river. And Big Harpe liked to just use his axe and chop everybody up. That was kind of the two known things they did. So the Harpes, during the Revolutionary War, had actually become outlaws for the British side. They were going around raping and destroying the patriots. Of course, America won the war and they had to find somewhere else to go, so they actually ended up in Nashville area, Tennessee, and actually joined some renegade Cherokee Indians that were still fighting against, the pioneers and of not, at that time. But that was resolved, and so they had to move on somewhere else. But during this time when they were out there, they actually kidnapped two girls, Susan and Maria, which they are known as Betsy, and this is kind of their makeshift wives, you might say, or just someone they kidnapped. So the actual first place that they moved with their new ladies that they kidnapped was Knoxville, Tennessee. After that, and they settled in a cabin along Beaver Creek up in Powell, Tennessee, or it could have been somewhere Halls or Hardin Valley, but most of them say it was around Powell. And Powell was established back then during that time and was a place, so that could very well be right where this happened. But during this time, they were going to try to make a living on these farms. So, and during this time, Wiley Littleheart met a woman called Sarah Rice, and he legally married her in Knoxville. And not to be, outdone by this, Micajah Bigart married Susan, the one of the ones they already had kidnapped, and then Betsy just became in between them. They just a concubine or whatever you call it. I'm not sure what you call that, but they were shared. She was shared. Now, while they were in Knox County, they actually were supposedly like hog farmers and raised hog and sold hogs, but they had more hogs than anybody, and they come to the conclusion that they were actually stealing a lot of people's hogs, maybe burning people's barns down, and actually all these hogs weren't there, and they more or less got caught and put in the Knoxville jail. But hey, they escaped. This will be the first time they escaped. Now, after their skirmish they had in Powell area, this is when everything's claimed that all the various big murders started happening on this. The first one would be a guy named Johnson in Knoxville, and supposedly they were maybe drinking at a tavern down there, and they got in a little bit of skirmish, and the guy and all the Harpes waited outside till Johnson left the tavern. Then they grabbed him, and then they killed him, and they cut his disemboweled him, cut him open, put rocks in him, and then threw him in the Holston River. So, they continued to move up toward Kentucky, and then they got in the Cumberland Gap up there in the Wilderness Road, and they murdered another guy, a peddler that was on the trail, and then they shot another men from Maryland, and robbed them, and then Harpe used the tomahawk, like to finish them off and split them up and do things, and then they'd take the belongings. It's just whoever you saw, you were going to get confronted with them pretty much. If you saw them, you're going to die just about. And then there was another gang of people that met him in the inn, and they felt sorry for him. This guy did actually, Mr. guy named Langford, and helped him out. And then later they said, "Hey, you want to ride with us? Because it'd be safer." And he said, "Sure." And then they killed him. So I mean, people that actually offered them nice stuff, they killed them. And then, believe it or not, they caught them at Crab Orchard, and then took them back to Kentucky, or they were in Kentucky, and put them in jail in Danville jail. And believe it or not, they escaped again. Now the women were here as well, and they were actually pregnant, and the town and everybody was okay with them and let them go and said, "Okay, you're not a part of this." But believe it or not, these women chose to go back down to the rivers and get in canoes and go find the Harpe brothers and join them back up again. It's kind of crazy, but that's the way it was. So then the Harpe brothers and their wives moved up in Illinois and met up with Samuel Mason, a river pirate, and basically hung around with those for a while. But what's so crazy about this is that they killed somebody up there by kidnapping them and stripping them and then putting them on a horse and then blinding the horse and hitting the horse and making it jump off a cliff, believe it or not, which was really crazy. But this was such a bad thing, even to the pirates, that they did not like them there, and this was not good. So they told them to leave. So they had to leave from here. So folks, this is real. It really gets bad, and I'll try to keep up with all these murders, but I mean this is where they just really went into a murdering spree of just killing anybody that they either met anywhere for any place or any circumstance. It didn't matter, man. You were pretty much signing your death warrant if you met these guys. So they started off going back toward Knoxville again, and they killed a farmer named Bradbury and near the Hardin Valley area, actually, in Knoxville again. And then they killed a young boy just for his rifle at Black Oak Ridge, which is Oak Ridge now. And then they continue on down and killed a Mr. Ballard, this guy, and they disemboweled and cut and put stones in it and threw him in the creek. And they also continued down in Tennessee, where they met up with these two brothers, and they were actually hunt for the Harpes, and they said, hey, join us. They actually were the Harpes, and we'll hunt for them. And they took them out, and they killed the first guy, brother, but the other brother actually managed to escape. And then when they came back with a posse, or to see what happened, they were just horrified that his brother was just, his body was just beaten and really bad, throat cut. And then at Tennessee, Kentucky border again, maybe the Cumberland Gap or areas like that, they killed a guy named Tully, and then they killed another guy named Graves, and his son, and then around Clay Lick Woods in Kentucky, the brothers slaughtered a whole entire family, folks. At least 10 men, women, and children murdered. Terrible. The bodies were actually stripped and mangled and, disfigured, which is terrible. And then they continued on down, and they killed a young girl who was actually out, picking berries, and they cut off her leg and then off her toes on her foot so they could keep some type of trophy. I mean, these guys were just soulless. And Big Harpe even killed his own baby. The baby was crying, and he got upset, and he picked the baby up, and he smacked it on a tree and killed it. I mean, how bad can that get? And then they continued on this murder spree. Just like to them, it just was no big deal. It just heartless. And so they even went in Kentucky and were disguised as Methodist preachers, believe it or not. And they came to this one family called the Stakal family, and they welcomed it in, said, hey, come in here, provide you a place. Again, that hospitality is the worst thing you can do these folks. And during that night, though, the baby was crying, and he killed him. I think Harpe, because he couldn't sleep, and then the next day when the mother of Skull, she saw it and said, oh my gosh. Then they killed her, and then as they were going out on the campsite with two guys, they killed those two guys. They robbed them, killed them, and it just kept going and kept going and going. But the law actually couldn't do a whole lot back then, because we're talking about primitive days, pioneer days. But they had enough. They had not warrants, but they had rewards with money on their thing. So they were trying to find them, and they actually did catch up with them in Kentucky. And then but Lil Harpe got away. So Moses Stakal, which was the guy whose family was killed at the Skull House, he came out there with a knife, says, I'm gonna make you pay. And slowly, because they'd shot Micajah, and he wasn't quite dead, so he took a knife and slowly cut his head off so he could feel it. I mean, yes, to make him suffer. And then Micajah kind of said something like, hey, you're a bad GD butcher, but continue on. And then, so Little Harpe, though, went back to the Mason gang, which was back at the Cave Rock. Again, I guess trying to find a place to go. And believe it or not, the Mason guy in charge of that says, oh, there's a bounty for him. And that's what I was going to try and say earlier, bounty. And guess what? Little Harpe and another guy said, hey, let's cut his head off. So they cut this pirate's head off. And this is not really funny in any way, but it kind of sort of is, because they took his head in to the law to get the bounty, and the law recognized him as being Little Harpe and arrested him. And then they hung him, and they also cut his head off and hung it up. Both of them's heads were cut off and put up on a plaque or sticker out in the public, so everybody would know if they do that again what would happen to them. But I mean, these guys were just almost unreal. So It's believed that, there's corpses and bodies all over Appalachians area from these guys. They've not found them all. They believe that it was up to 50 people that they confessed to before they died. But most believe it's more like 100 or more because, anybody they ran into, pretty much if they couldn't get away or they could power over them, they would have killed them. It's not a story that you're going to hear in your history books, but it is nevertheless kind of a crazy big story of the first serial killers in the United States.